Wherever Santa Claus lives, and in whatever spot of the universe he harnesses his reindeer and loads up his sleigh, one thing is certain: he never yet put anything into that sleigh for little Carl Krinken. Indeed, it may be noted as a fact that the Christmas of poor children has but little of his care. Now and then a cast-off frock or an extra mince pie slips into the load, as it were, accidentally. But in general, Santa Claus aims at higher game: gilt books and sugar plums and fur tippets and new hoods and crying babies and rocking horses and guns and drums and trumpets. And what have poor children to do with these? Not but that they might have something to do with them. It is a singular fact that poor children cut their teeth quite as early as the rich. Even that sweet tooth which is destined to be an unsatisfied tooth all the days of its life, unless its owner should perchance grow up to be a sugar refiner. It is also remarkable that though poor children can bear a great deal of cold, they can also enjoy being warm, whether by means of a new dress or a load of firing, and the glow of a bright blaze looks just as comfortable upon little cheeks that are generally blue as upon little cheeks that are generally red, while not even dirt will hinder the kindly heat of a fire of coals from rejoicing the little fingers that are held over it. I say all this is strange, for nobody knows much about it, and how can they? When a little girl once went down Broadway with her muff and her doll, the hand outside the muff told the hand within that he had no idea what a cold day it was, and the hand inside said that for his part he had never wished it to be warmer. But with all this, Santa Claus never troubled his head. He was too full of business, and wrapped up in buffalo skins besides, and though he sometimes thought of little Carl as a good-natured little fellow who talked as much about him as if Santa Claus had given him half the world, yet it ended with a thought, for his hands were indeed well occupied. It was no trifle to fill 500,000 of rich little stockings, and then how many poor children had none to fill? Or if one chanced to be found, it might have holes in it, and if the sugar plums should come rolling down upon such a floor. To be sure, the children would not mind that, but Santa Claus would. Nevertheless, little Carl always hung up his stocking, and generally had it filled, though not from any sleigh load of wonderful things, and he often amused himself on Christmas Eve with dreaming that he had made himself sick with eating candy, and that they had a pile of mince pies as high as the house. So altogether, what with dreams and realities, Carl enjoyed that time of the year very much, and thought it was a great pity Christmas did not come every day. He was always contented too with what he found in his stocking, while some of his little rich neighbours had theirs filled only to their heart's discontent, and fretted because they had got what they did not want, or for something that they had not got. It was a woeful thing if a top was painted the wrong colour, or if the mane of a rocking horse was too short, or if his bridle was of black leather instead of red. But when Carl once found in his stocking a little board nailed upon 4 reels for wheels, and with nothing better than a long piece of twine to draw it with, his little tongue ran as fast as the reels, and he had brought his mother a very small load of chips in less than 5 minutes, and a small cake of maple sugar which somehow once found its way to the same depending toe, was a treasure quite too great to be weighed, though it measured only 1.5 inches across, and though the maple tree had grown about 1 foot since it was made. "Wife," said John Krinken, "what shall we put into little Carl's stocking tonight?" "Truly," said his wife, "I do not know. Nevertheless, we must find something, though there be but little in the house." And the wind swept round and round the old hut, and every cupboard rattled and said in an empty sort of way, "There is not much here." John Krinken and his wife lived on the coast, where they could hear every winter storm rage and beat, and where the wild sea sometimes brought wood for them and laid it at their very door. It was a driftwood fire by which they sat now this Christmas Eve, the crooked knee of some ship and a bit of her keel, with nails and spikes held in their places by rust, and a piece of green board stuck under to light the hole. The andirons were 2 round stones, and the hearth was a flat one, and in front of the fire sat John Krinken on an old box making a fishing net, while a splinter chair upheld Mrs. Krinken and a half-mended red flannel shirt. An old chest between the two held patches and balls of twine, and the crooked knee, the keel, and the green board were their only candles. "We must find something," repeated John, and pausing with his netting needle half through the loop, he looked round towards one corner of the hut. A clean rosy little face and a very glossy set of thick curls rested there in the very middle of the thin pillow and the hard bed, while the coverlet of blue check was tucked round and in, lest the driftwood fire should not do its duty at that distance. John Krinken and his wife refreshed themselves with a long look, and then returned to their work. "You've got the stocking, wife?" said John after a pause. "Aye," said his wife. "It is easy to find something to fill." "Fetch it out then, and let us see how much it will take to fill it." Mrs. Krinken arose, and going to one of the two little cupboards, she brought thence a large iron key, and then, having placed the patches and thread upon the floor, she opened the chest and rummaged out a long grey woolen stocking with a white toe and heel and various darns in red. Then she locked the chest again and sat down as before. "The same old thing," said John Krinken with a glance at the stocking. "Well," said his wife, "it's the only stocking in the house that is long enough." "I know one thing he shall have in it," said John, and he got up and went to the other cupboard and fetched from it a large piece of cork. "He shall have a boat that will float like one of Mother Carey's chickens," and he began to cut and shape with his large clasp knife, while the little heap of chips on the floor between his feet grew larger, and the cork grew more and more like a boat. His wife laid down her hand, which was in the sleeve of the red jacket, and watched him. "It will never do to put that in first," she said. "The masts would be broken. I think I'll fill the toe of the stocking with apples." "And where will you get apples?" said John Krinken, shaping the keel of his boat. "I've got them," said his wife, 3 rosy-cheeked apples. "Last Saturday as I came from market a man went by with a load of apples, and as I came on I found that he had dropped 3 out of his wagon. So I picked them up." "3 apples," said John. "Well, I'll give him a penny to fill up the chinks." "And I've got an old purse that he can keep it in," said the mother. "How long do you suppose he will keep it?" said John. "Well, he'll want to put it somewhere while he does keep it," said Mrs. Krinken. "The purse is old, but it was handsome once, and it will please the child anyway. And then there are his new shoes." So when the boat was done, Mrs. Krinken brought out the apples and slipped them into the stocking, and then the shoes went in, and the purse, and the penny, which of course ran all the way down to the biggest red darn of all, in the very toe of the stocking. But there was still abundance of room left. "If only one had some sugar things," said Mrs. Krinken. "Or some nuts," said John. "Or a book," rejoined his wife. "Carl takes to his book wonderfully." "Yes," said John. "All 3 would fill up in fine style." "Well, there is a book he can have, only I don't know what it is about nor whether he would like it. That poor lady we took from an American wreck when I was mate of the Skene Elf had it in her pocket, and she gave it to me when she died, because I didn't let her die in the water, poor soul. She said it was worth a great deal, and I think the clasp is silver." "Oh, I dare say he would like it," said Mrs. Krinken. "Give him that, and I'll put in the old pine cone. He's old enough to take care of it now. I think he will be content." The book, with its worn leather binding and tarnished silver clasp, was dusted and rubbed up and put in, and the old sharp-pointed pine cone followed, and the fisherman and his wife followed it up with a great deal of love and a blessing. And then the stocking was quite full. It was midnight, and the fire had long been covered up, and John Krinken and his wife were fast asleep, and little Carl was in the midst of the hard bed and his sweet dreams as before. The stocking hung by the side of the little fireplace, as still as if it had never walked about in its life, and not a sound could be heard but the beat of the surf upon the shore, and an occasional sigh from the wind, for the wind is always melancholy at Christmas. Once or twice an old rat peeped cautiously out of his hole, and seeing nobody, had crossed the floor and sat down in front of the stocking, which his sharp nose immediately pointed out to him. But though he could smell the apples plainly enough, he was afraid that long thing might hold a trap as well, and so he did nothing but smell and snuff and show his teeth. As for the little mice, they ran out and danced a measure on the hearth and then back again, after which one of them squealed for some time for the amusement of the rest. But just at midnight there was another noise heard, as somebody says, you could hear on the roof the scraping and prancing of each little hoof, and down came Santa Claus through the chimney. He must have set out very early that night to have so much time to spare, or perhaps he was cold in spite of his furs, for he came empty-handed and had evidently no business calls in that direction, but the first thing he did was to examine the stocking and its contents. At some of the articles he laughed, and at some he frowned, But most of all did he shake his head over the love that filled up all the spare room in the stocking. It was a kind of thing Santa Claus was not used to. The little stockings were generally too full for anything of that sort. When they had to hold candy enough to make the child sick, and toys enough to make him unhappy because he did not know which to play with first, of course very little love could get in. And there is no telling how many children would be satisfied if it did. But Santa Claus put all the things back just as he had found them, and stood smiling to himself for a minute, with his hands on his sides and his back to the fire. Then, tapping the stocking with a little stick that he carried, he bent down over Carl and whispered some words in his ear, and went off up the chimney. And the little mice came out and danced on the floor till the day broke. Christmas Day in the morning, and what a day it was! All night long, as the hours went by, the waves had beaten time with their heavy feet, and wherever the foam and spray had fallen upon board or stone or crooked stick, there it had frozen, in long icicles or fringes or little white caps. But when the sun had climbed out of the leaden sea, every morsel of foam and ice sparkled and twinkled like morning stars, and the day got her cheeks warm and glowing as fast as she could. And the next thing the sun did was to walk in at the hut window and look at little Carl Krinken. Then it laid a warm hand upon his little face, and Carl had hardly smiled away the last bit of his dream before he started up in bed and shouted, "Merry Christmas!" The mice were much alarmed, for they had not all seen their partners safe home, but they got out of the way as fast as they could, and when Carl bounded out of bed he stood alone upon the floor. The floor felt cold, very. Carl's toes curled up in the most disapproving manner possible, and he tried standing on his heels. Then he scampered across the floor and began to feel at the stocking, beginning at the top. It was plain enough what the shoes were, but the other things puzzled him till he got to the foot of the stocking, and his feet being by that time very cold, for both toes and heels had rested on the floor in the eagerness of examination. Carl seized the stocking in both hands and scampered back to bed again, screaming out, "Apples, apples, apples!" His mother being now awakened by his clambering over her for the second time, she gave him a kiss and a Merry Christmas and got up, and as his father did the same, Carl was left in undisturbed possession of the warm bed. There he laid himself down as snug as could be with the long stocking by his side, and began to pull out and examine the things one by one, after which each article was laid on the counterpane outside. "Well, my boy, how do you like your things?" said Mrs. Krinken, coming up to the bed just when Carl and the empty stocking lay side by side. "First rate," said Carl. "Mother, I dreamed last night that all my presents told me stories. Wasn't it funny?" "Yes, I suppose so," said his mother as she walked away to turn the fish that was broiling. Carl lay still and looked at the stocking. "Where did you come from, old stocking?" said he. "From England," said the stocking very softly. Carl started up in bed and looked between the sheets and over the counterpane and behind the headboard. There was nothing to be seen. Then he shook the stocking as hard as he could, but something in it struck his other hand rather hard too. Carl laid it down and looked at it again, and then cautiously putting in his hand, he with some difficulty found his way to the very toe. There lay the penny, just where it had been all the time, upon the largest of the red darns. "A penny!" cried Carl. "Oh, I suppose it was you who was talking, wasn't it?" "No," said the penny, "but I can talk." "Do you know where you came from?" said Carl, staring at the penny with all his eyes. "Certainly," said the penny. "I dreamed that everything in my stocking told me a story." "So we will," said the penny. "Only to you, to nobody else." Carl shook his head very gravely, and having slipped the penny into the little old purse, he put everything into the stocking again and jumped out of bed, for the driftwood fire was blazing up to the very top of the little fireplace, and breakfast was almost ready upon the old chest. But as soon as breakfast was over, Carl carried the stocking to one corner of the hut where stood another old chest, and laying out all his treasures thereon, he knelt down before it. "Now begin," he said, "but you mustn't all talk at once. I think I will hear the apples first, because I might want to eat them up. I don't care which begins."